You are listening to the e-flux podcast.
It's a real pleasure to be sitting with Metahaven, with Daniil van der Velden from Metahaven, a duo from Amsterdam. Unfortunately, Vinka Krook is not with us, but will be later tonight for our event at e-flux. Metahaven, their work consists of filmmaking, writing, and design. Films by Metahaven include The Sprawl, Propaganda About Propaganda from 2015, Information Skies from 2016, Hometown from 2018, and Eurasia, Questions on Happiness from 2018. Recently, they had an exhibition, Version History, at the ICA in London, and Earth at Stedelijk in Amsterdam, both in 2018. It should be said that Metahaven are longtime contributors to e-flux Journal, and it's been really nice to be in conversation with them for, probably over a decade now, and to have seen many changes in their thinking and in their interests, but then to see also many things stay the same or turn around slightly, right? Not an inappropriate term, considering the title of their exhibition on now at e-flux, Turnarounds, which goes until November 2nd and opened just the other day. So, maybe we should start by talking about the film Hometown, which is the kind of centerpiece of this exhibition. But also, I have to say that in thinking about a lot of the themes and the ideas in this work, I'm always reminded of one of my favorite essays that they wrote, which is probably in 2000, could have been even like 2009, so like a decade ago. A text called Brand States, where Daniil and Vinka were looking at the design of tourism logos, at state branding. And they pointed out in this text something that was a kind of a real revelation for me at the time, that tourism logos had become, or maybe always were, in some sense, more familiar and more recognizable than state flags. Right? State flags, which are presumably designed by governments, by official bodies, but then the more kind of entrepreneurial side of existing or being seen as a nation or as a state was actually really operative. And so at the time, it was a really interesting kind of a critique. But then now, I think they have gone much deeper into this question. And it becomes interesting to ask about the space of dreaming and dream space in relation to politics, where with many of these films, including Hometown, it's almost like dreams produce a certain kind of politics, just as politics also produce a certain kind of space of dreaming. And with Hometown, I think also this space is somehow mediated also by an understanding of childhood. Daniil, thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Brian. It's really great. I think that Brand Stage was from 2008.
Wow.
Even, yeah. And at the time...
11 years ago.
Yeah. And at the time, we were interested in the idea that, which is the basic idea of neoliberal statehood in the late 1990s and early 2000s, that all states are basically full market actors. And that the idea of state power as a sort of coercive idea or a coercive force needs to be bended, as it were, to something that would attract people. And it's interesting you mention it, because it seems like in the wider world we've arrived in that combination of geopolitics, power, and image almost at the opposite end. I'm not sure if we're over, let's say, the North Pole of this idea, but it seems like that we're always mistrustful of the idea that sort of branding and soft power could replace politics. But it turned out that negative brand power is also brand power, as we know and see. Yeah.
How would you characterize negative brand power?
Well, in order to answer that question, I first want to say something about our films, because I think that we gotten quite far away from those notions of sort of branding, graphic design, visual communication in that sense. Like we use it as a visual method, but we don't use these as outcomes necessarily always. And the idea that there is a desirable, or there's a not so much a desirable, but there's a projection of what constitutes desirability within a given framework of relationships. And what we've seen, I'm not sure whether this is going to be like way too bold, what I'm saying now, but what we've seen is that there is a number of, very large challenges to the planet on various scales, where people have to create shortcuts, cognitive shortcuts for these challenges. I'm not saying this is good or bad. This just seems to be what's by and large sort of happening. And within that kind of like situation, one of the shortcuts is authoritarianism. The idea that the democratic process or the market process are not going to create the outcome, and that we're going to fetishize the notion of someone sort of cutting right through that and doing what needs to be done at whatever cost. So interestingly, when we wrote Brand States, North Korea was sort of the outcast of the system that was described in terms of desirability. Now you could argue that North Korea is almost one of the central images in that sort of constellation. And that goes together with enormous amount of repression and enormous amount of kitsch. And it requires a form of media reading, like an interest in like media literacy on the level of planetary imagery, in a sense, that we've always been really interested in. And kind of like Brand States was maybe an early sort of iteration of that.
Does it relate to the way that you moved from design and branding into kind of full-blown cinematic works? Was there a need or a desire to create like a different kind of idiom or different grammar for navigating these?
I think that we were never really a branding studio. We were mostly busy critiquing branding, but we were interested in it because we were interested in the way that sovereignty operates in both fake and real ways in a kind of planetary context, and ways in which you could redefine or think about that notion of sovereignty in the context of sort of information networks, as we called it at the time, what was formerly known as the internet. Right. And making films is simply a way to be able to narrate a larger, to create a larger unit for a narrative, to narrate it sort of emotionally in a way, as well as, argumentatively, although there isn't much argument in Hometown in that sense, to fall back on. And I think also a way for us to expand from the notion of projects to the notion of practice. So the idea that a film usually takes like at minimum a year to create, and that is a time frame we really like, because it is a time frame in which the notion of the project starts to sort of like slowly disappear. It becomes like a practice, and that's something we're interested in. Yeah.
So how did you develop Hometown then? Can you maybe you can explain a bit how the structure of the film, also for many of our listeners who may not have seen it?
I hope you might want to play some music from Hometown on the podcast at some point. Yeah, music made by Safa, a Beirut-based musician and architect. The film developed out of a series of personal experiences around 2017, late 2016, which confronted us, I think, with the resilience and elasticity of childhood and children. And we were at the time starting to read a volume of Russian children's poetry, which has just come out at the time, translated in Dutch. And in this volume, there were a lot of poems that we would call, in a Western idiom, we would call them absurdist. Things happen in these poems that primarily call into question the reliability of the narrator and the reliability of the narration. Yet they are hugely entertaining, very, very beautiful, moving, funny, and also witty sometimes. So these starting points were important for hometown. Children's poetry, notion of resilience of children, and next to that, another factor, which was our reading of a book by Svetlana Boym, the late Svetlana Boym, in which she describes a poem by Giorgio Caproni about a red tablecloth. And she describes that in this poem, he recalls a red tablecloth in a place where, like, he writes basically about a homecoming, and he writes that everything is like it never was. And there's the red checkered tablecloth. And after she cites that poem, she starts to write about the way in which this evokes a certain image, even she never had one of these tablecloths, etc. So we were interested in this form of recognition that happens. And this became the building blocks for the script. And now at the same time, we had worked for our previous film, then Information Skies, with a Ukrainian-based and-born fashion designer, Yulia Yefimchuk, who did all costume or a lot of costume for Information Skies. And we had somehow interviewed her for the publication Psyop, which came out last year. And there was an interest in Metahaven and Yulia Yefimchuk doing something more. So we decided, because they are based in Kyiv, we were like, okay, let's shoot hometown half in Kyiv. And at the same time, we were doing some work at Ashkol Awan in Beirut, a educational center, an art center there, which allowed us to stay for a couple of weeks in Beirut. And we thought we should shoot half of the film also in Beirut and construct a hometown that could never be coherent out of those two cities.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting to think about how the role of the child, or the perspective of the child, relates to these shortcuts that you describe, right? So these shortcuts between political ideas and some kind of a solution, which is often the space where propaganda or authoritarianism sort of issues these false promises. And all of your work, I think, at least for me, has always had a really interesting kind of combination between a certain kind of brute realism, but also a kind of festive or even sometimes kind of enchanted wonder. So
thank you.
Yeah, but so then even when dealing in a critical mode, there's a kind of wonder or even kind of bewilderment as you kind of meticulously will dismantle or take apart how a certain visual grammar or works ideologically. There is still this kind of real wonder in the way it works. So I wonder also about how the role of the child is almost a kind of, rather than being a kind of a neutral receiver, is actually a source of some kind of agency or some kind of power in relation to these brute systems.
Yeah, like, of course, we wouldn't be the first people to work around the notion of the child. You know, there's a lot of thought about this existing. I remember recently I had a conversation.
Children have been around for a while.
Absolutely. And also thinking about children has been around for a while. And I think that like recently I had a conversation with somebody in Berlin who said like, well, it's all about innocence, isn't it? Like your films are like so full of innocence. And I was, of course, contesting that. You know, I was like, of course not. You know, it's way more like tricky than that. And it's not about that. But I was then thinking later, like, why deny that? Why deny that we are interested in that position as well? I think that there's no such thing as the child, and there's even no such thing as children, because they're like literally like all different. But what we know is that children have, when they grow up and they're like between, let's say, 2 and 7, 8, 9, a lot of the characteristics of their personality are coming into formation, including their relationship to things like, ethics and morality. And the way that these character traits or the personalities come into being is completely disjointed and uneven. It's not that they sort of arrive at, a kind of completely built version of the world when they become like 8 or something. Everything is sort of disjointed, and there's a lot of scale shifts. So you started with the anecdote about the murdered caterpillar, which is a sort of dream image that comes up in the film. And both the protagonists deny responsibility for the crime. But later on, they do talk about morality, or they talk about there's a certain mourning of the loss. And this idea of being able to navigate contradictions that exist in the way that the world is unresolved and the world is completely in the moment is something that gives children a certain agility. And I don't mean to say that agility is there to be then used for whatever end one can imagine. Of course not. I'm just saying that we can sometimes learn from that. And so this is, we're interested. The film doesn't have any children physically, there are no children in the film, but it's as if the protagonists are sort of like recapturing childhood to some extent. But I agree with you that the idea of dreaming in general, and then the idea of a kind of, I don't know exactly how you said it, but you said something about, on the one hand, a sort of hardcore realism, on the other hand, completely not, has always been a part of our approach.
Wonder.
Yeah, wonder, exactly. Yeah. And lately we were interested in the term lyricality in this respect, especially in its sort of contrast to the term criticality.
Yeah, I remember in the days of brand states, you would speak, I think maybe even you would say that you wanted to do state branding, but then at the same time your approach was so critical. I'm not sure any actual states were maybe some were calling you up to do this state branding, but it was always a very affirmative, but also highly critical approach to what you were doing, and it was very complex.
Well, at the time, we were really interested in the idea of the proposal. So we were not so much maybe interested in resolving the questions of, that people that really want to have a brand for their state are asking themselves. We were interested in the space where to sort of enter into that space. Two examples. One was a session about nation branding in Estonia that we attended. And the other was a conversation with the Ministry of Culture of Slovenia. So we started with, kind of like mini states in Europe, in a way, because we were also interested in the notion of the exception, the notion of what then was called e-government, or the idea of a sort of digital, digital layers over government. And we're talking here like 2007 or something.
A seasteading.
Yeah, also that, but that has more libertarian, a more libertarian and currently politically even more problematic than just libertarian connotations. Yep. But, other than that, we had done one project about a sort of semi-fictional state that wanted to be a data haven, etc. Like Sealand, our first project, and then we thought, we've got this critical attitude towards these things, and at the same sort of a bit of a sort of abrasive attitude or towards it. Let's try if we can, do something in that space. So it was a kind of like a question of reaching out rather boldly to people that weren't interested in us.
One thing that I've always wanted to ask you, actually reminds me that maybe I never even asked you this directly. What exactly, or if you can pinpoint the kind of transition that you made from this approach into cinema? How did you start to explore using cinema?
Well, it turns out that we were often helping other people making films. So like students, or we were at some point asked to design titles for a major documentary, or we did some music videos, and those rolled us sort of into the idea that you can create an image with a certain amount of texture, and also an image with a certain amount of I wouldn't call it mistake, but something that you cannot simply not predict completely and shape completely as you can do in the computer when you model something or draw something.
Maybe more mystique than mistake.
Yeah, a space that
cut that one.
A space that's sort of
dad
more
jokes.
You can keep it, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. Something that's between, that has a more interesting space coming from a design background, towards intentionality, because there are certain things you can control, and there are certain things you can indicate or try to have be in a certain way, but it might turn out slightly different from what you wanted. And I think editing music videos got us kind of emotionally hooked on what the combination of sound and image can do.
Right.
With as a result, these processes took an insanely long time to finish. It took us like half a year to finish like a 4-minute music video, for example. But we were also really interested in the production side of these things, like organizing, people coming together for a shoot, getting, this kind of production aspects of film have always interested us since we started doing them. I wouldn't call them purely cinema. I think they're like cinematic, or they're attempting to be cinematic artworks in a way, but they are expressly not sort of cinema as in, as in going to the cinema. But they have narrative elements, and they have elements where you can sense, the duration that you're coming into. So they're also not, in that sense, purely art videos. They have a more cinematic tendency in them.
Yeah. I wondered about them. I remember wondering also because of the way they kind of celebrate it and use affects. Because, especially when dealing in a more critical mode, affects are usually assumed to be some kind of like a raw material or some kind of like waste product or something. When, something for propaganda or for the masses, or right. But then, especially in something like Information Skies, it's like affect is everywhere. It's so openly kind of dripping with affect. So and that's what in a way marks it as a full on kind of like super cinema. No, it's like this is what gives it also a really cinematic feeling. That to me marked a really almost like a 180-degree shift.
The Information Skies was the sequel to the Sprawl, Propaganda About Propaganda, which was a sort of fiction documentary from 2015. So it had some of the same actors in it. It was very much the sort of fictional sequel to something that was still partially documentary. And I think that so it wasn't for us. I don't think it was a 180-degree turn. I think it was just zooming into an aspect that was somewhere in the Sprawl, but that we wanted to like go further with, in a sense. It was also the first film which had that sort of like poem as lyrics or as text or monologue, and it was the first film where we just went out of voiceover and actually started to work with an embodied voice. An actor that actually really speaks on screen. It's not like so that idea of someone who narrates you through something is maybe sometimes there, but not to the extent that it was previously, and not to the extent that it is in a kind of what you would typically think of as the essay film, which is one of those genres that it's kind of like near to some extent. Yeah, I mean, when you say that it had a lot of affect, or that it did that for you, I believe you.
Yeah, there was also a big shift because, like in the Sprawl, right, also kind of subtitled Propaganda About Propaganda, there's a lot of voiceover, smart people, critical voices, telling you how it is. But then in Information Skies, really heavy color correction, a lot of scenes of looking into the air, into space somewhere, very, very dreamlike film. Right?
Yeah, I think that it has worked for people in that way. With the Sprawl, the notion of the people that we interviewed, Benjamin Bratton, Mona Lisa Garavi, and Peter Pomerantsev, I think we try to have them not be people that tell you how things are. I think that is inevitably what happens when you have a talking head in a documentary. But in fact, what we did with them was that we showed them footage that we found. And we filmed them while they would watch the footage, and then they would react to it. And with somebody like Mona Lisa, she just was so good at sort of like talking about this footage that it became fully integrated with the footage itself, as it was shown in the film. Whereas Benjamin Bratton really has, and at that time was working on Theory of the Stack, the book that came out in 2016, and he just clearly was going to talk about that a lot. And Peter Pomerantsev's book had come out a year before, and he was going to sort of like only talk about that. He wouldn't go a millimeter off the party line in that sense. Yeah.
Yeah, so in many of these works, especially beginning with the sprawl, you were thinking about propaganda and about the narrative, about the use of narrative and literary forms in constructing a sense of reality and even a sense of how events change and evolve in time. How would you say that this is? Would you say that Hometown also has its own kind of way of dealing with this, especially in the way that it uses the child?
Yeah, I think that the works are concerned with narrative, but maybe more so with the idea of the voice or the idea of the account. So all the scripts are kind of like accounts of how it is to be in certain circumstances. The plot is there, but it's sort of compared to mainstream, this is very plotless film. There's almost like no plot, and sometimes there's almost no meaning. I think that when you talk about narrative, you talk about ultimately about a affect-laden form that is compact enough to be understood or to be remembered by human minds in a way. You talk about something that is, especially in times where there is a big suspicion around notions of abstraction and complexity, narrative sort of comes out as the alternative at the other end. But every narrative asks questions about the way in which language is able to or not able to make constative or performative statements, and ultimately if the narrator has a basis in reliability or not. So there is, in a sense, when we are suspending disbelief in a film, we are like getting so immersed that we forget that there's something else. When you think about the way that poetry, for example, can approach this, that poems do not fall back on a kind of ground layer, maybe sometimes in the same way that stories do or like narratives do. Nevertheless, they have to put up certain coordinates and a certain phasing and timing to make things cohesive enough so that it can be discerned as a poem and that it can be experienced as a poem. But we were interested in the sprawl, like in poetry, because it would add a voice that would be so missing from the type of discourse that was going around, geopolitically, and it would so capture the essence of what was going on, or like so it would so capture the forgotten side of what was going on. And now I think having moved sort of further into that, we're maybe also interested in ways in which poetry can undercut or question the means by which we arrive at thinking that a certain statement is believable, trustworthy, or credible, or, in that sense, without it being about fact-checking. It is more about and here we're relying on, a bunch of poets, including Alexander Vvedensky, Daniil Kharms, and other poets that were active in the 1920s, 30s, and early 1940s until they met their end. And that developed, poetic strategies that are now called absurdism, but they aren't really about the absurd.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yes, I think this is actually the most important thing about this approach. It's a very kind of a delicate way of handling it that you have developed. But you spoke about the shortcuts, the place where authoritarianism kind of creeps in promising that you can kind of skip through a number of steps, say dealing with history, and you can just get what you want right away. I mean, you've described this elsewhere. I think also in the text that you are writing about the place where complex systems of information start to connect to this kind of creeping authoritarianism that we find around us. So it's very interesting that you. Right, so of course, this is with fake news. It's wrong to say that. Well, then you just fact check your way back to the real, right? It doesn't really happen like that, right? Because the real kind of almost a question for philosophy is like when was there really ever real news, right? You cannot exactly make news real again, so it doesn't really work like that. Then rather than the shortcut, you actually what you are proposing are ways to inhabit a space of contradiction.
Yes.
Could you say a bit about that, by way of closing? Because I think it's a very good closer. It's such a good closer.
I think that there's, with this sort of poetic approaches and strategies, there's always, the perennial question whether these are strategies of revolt and revolution or whether they are strategies of coping. And I think that those are, that's a very important duality that I think many people find themselves in. The idea that like a revolutionary narrative is sort of in and by itself enough to create, the momentum and then overcome it and sort of create a new world will sort of never be true, in itself. Like in part because revolutionary movements have always tried to, after they, did their thing, then conserve that, which led to them becoming the opposite of what they were intending to be. So I think that with the notion of, you mentioned fake news. I think words like fake news and post-truth should, if they are at all, used, should be used heavily contextualized, because they are themselves rhetorical devices. These words, they're not in any way facts themselves. I think that what is important is that rhetorical form, metaphor, metonym, and allegory, and variations and combinations of these can be supercharged in ways that they weren't before. So if you think about the origins of these speech figures, they come from basically what one would call, quote unquote, the Greek polis or something like that, when there would be an oratory necessity to convince the polis of this or that idea or proposal. But if you think about these forms in the absence of the Greek polis, but with their own sort of scaling and bubble forming mechanisms, they occupy the place of exactly that sense of wonder and curiosity that you were like talking about earlier. And we see this, I think, across the board, especially, in the far right, that the extensive use of metaphor and often in combination with, insult, free speech, pejoratives, etc., next to, of course, the militarization and like weaponization of these movements at the same time, are taking the place of information in general. And I think that's what we're interested in, because often we get the impression from the analysis that the people that are on Twitter are, and especially the ones on the right, are winning. They have a bigger majority. They're so good with memes. They're like this and that. But you have to look at this complex as a very patchy complex, because it's actually it's largely created around metaphor, metonyms, and allegories that then become supercharged. And I think this in this way, absurdist poetry and the complete the distrust that poetry displayed and performed in relationship to the kind of like performative functions of language is very sort of interesting to look at right now and look into right now. Not as a way to be all arty-farty about politics, but as a way to really question what is the language that we need, that we want.
Daniil van der Velden from Metahaven, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And now we'll listen to a small snippet from Safa, producer from Beirut's soundtrack for Hometown.